Good morning. Top of the morning to you. Happy Lord's Day. If one of Israel's promises is consummated at the Parousia, then all are. The, quote, but not yet, unquote. It is imperative and vital to understand this concept if one is to understand eschatology, Bible prophecy, and especially Israel's promises and second coming. The promises are not given out in piecemeal. And we have in the New Testament, and all New Testament scholars understand this, and all different eschatologies understand this, even the dispensationalists, which don't understand a lot. There's an already, but not yet. The already, but not yet. There's an already of the promises of the Abrahamic, Davidic, and New Covenant. They were established at the cross. The already, but not yet. The but not yet would be at the second coming of Christ. Most of the time in the New Testament we see the promises referred to. We see a litany of them all over the place in referring to the work of Christ, and that alone is detrimental to dispensationalism, as the church and Israel are distinct groups of people, and in the church age there is no promises for Israel or for the church. They're completely distinct, and yet they will admit that some of the promises did kind of slip through. The Abrahamic covenant kind of slipped through just a little bit of inconsistency there. But I want to start very briefly with a text I've been hammering on, and I'm not going to take a half hour like I did with two videos on Isaiah 2, but very briefly, Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2 is a time of the kingdom. It's a time of Zion being restored. Isaiah 2 through 4, and Malachi chapter 4, 1 and following. This is the time of the kingdom, Zion, so on and so forth. And yet, verse 12 and following, it is the time of judgment. And in verse 10 through 21, we see judgment of men hiding in the clefts of the rocks and in the caves from the splendor and glory and wrath of the Lord. And yet Jesus quotes, applies Isaiah 2, 10, 19, and 21 to AD 70 in Luke chapter 23. In Luke chapter 23, the daughters of Jerusalem, they're weeping for Jesus as he's being led astray. His disciples, his beloved disciples, were weeping for him. He says, "Weep not for me." Jesus wasn't concerned about himself, the great love he had. "Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children," because it would be just a little bit far off. "Weep not for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children, for the time will come when they will say, 'Rocks hiding us,' so on and so forth. 'Hills cover us from the glory of the Lord,'" Isaiah chapter 2. If Jesus applies Isaiah chapter 2 to AD 70 and his second coming, not the already, but the not yet, the second coming, to AD 70, that's good enough for me. Paul in 2 Thessalonians 1, chapter 1, verse 4 through 10, speaks of the persecution under the Jews, because there was no persecution at the time that Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, shortly after 1 Thessalonians, of a Roman persecution. That was not until 64, the first imperial persecution. The persecution of the Jews, and he quotes Isaiah chapter 2, 10, 19, and 21, that they would be cast out of the presence of the Lord and his glory. Yet verse 10, the saints would be glorified. When would this happen? When the persecutors would receive tribulation for giving tribulation to those at Thessalonica, the Jews, AD 70. Revelation chapter 6, we see the first four seals, death, famine, pestilence, so on. is taken from Matthew chapter 24. Then we see the saints underneath the altar, probably the altar of incense in the most holy place, or in the holy place. How long, O Lord, will you not avenge our blood? Well, Luke 11, the parable there of the wicked judge, says he will avenge them speedily. He will avenge the martyrs speedily. Will he find faith on the earth or land? Gay. He will avenge them speedily. All the blood of all the righteous, all the way back from Abel to Zechariah, will be required of this generation. Covenantal sanctions coming upon that cultimus generation. So again, that is Matthew 23 and 24 as well, Revelation chapter 6. But also in Revelation chapter 6, it quotes from Isaiah chapter 2. Let me get that briefly, then we'll move on. Isaiah 2 didn't take a half hour this time. Didn't take a half hour this time. Revelation chapter 6. Yeah, in verse 10 we see Deuteronomy 32 spoken of in the avenging of the blood of the prophets, and we know that Deuteronomy 32 according to Acts 2:40, Romans 10, Hebrews 10, all contexts of national Israel of their day, Peter and Paul's day, and the writer of Hebrews, and they apply Deuteronomy 32 to Israel of their day. But Isaiah chapter 2. Isaiah chapter 2 is found in verse 15 and 16. Then the kings of the earth and the great men and the commanders and the rich and the strong and every slave and free man hid themselves in the caves among the rocks and the mountains. Isaiah 2:10, 19 and 21. And they said to the mountains and the rocks, fall on us and hide us from the presence of him who sits on the throne and from the wrath of the Lamb. For the great day of their wrath has come. Who is able to stand? And this is AD 70. I can demonstrate that very easily. So we got through Isaiah chapter 2 rather quickly. Now we're going to go to passages that allude, echo the Old Testament. We're going to go very briefly through some of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and hit on Revelation in a couple spots. First off, Matthew chapter 21, verse 42 and verse 44, which is the parable of the wicked husbandman, Matthew 21, 33 through 44, which all agree is AD 70. The servants are sent unto them, are sent unto the husbandmen to gather the fruits. And yet the slaves were persecuted. They were cast out. They sent the son, the heir. He was cast out. They sent more prophets. They were cast out. And yet this would be the time of the coming of wrath, and the sons of the kingdom cast out. Matthew chapter 21. And verse 42 through 44, we see Psalm chapter 118. We see Isaiah chapter 8:14 quoted. And those two passages are the Messianic temple. They are the Messianic temple, Jesus being the chief cornerstone, Ephesians 2:11 and following, 1 Peter 2:4 and following. This is the Messianic, the millennial Davidic temple. And in Matthew 21 verse 44, we have Zechariah 12:3 being alluded to. And we have Daniel chapter 2 verse 34, 35, and 44. Now let's compare that to Luke chapter 20, the parable of the wicked husbandman, Luke's version of Matthew 21. We have Psalm 118, we have Isaiah chapter 8:14, Zechariah 12:3, and Daniel 2:44. Pretty much identical. And so we see in the fall of Jerusalem, as all agree Matthew 21 and Luke 20 are AD 70, whether you're a preterist or not, we have the Davidic temple being established. And of course it's the time of the coming kingdom. That's the parable. We have Zechariah chapter 12 verse 3. And Zechariah 12 through 14 is one section. And we have Daniel chapter 2 verse 34, 35, and 44. That great kingdom that would hit the feet of the stone would be established in AD 70. So we see clearly here that the Davidic kingdom of Psalm 118, Isaiah chapter 8, the Messianic temple of the Davidic kingdom, Zechariah chapter 12, which is the Davidic kingdom, and Daniel 2, which is the Davidic kingdom, would be established according to Christ in Matthew 21 and Luke chapter 20 at the fall of Jerusalem. Let's move on to the Olivet Discourse in Matthew chapter 24 and Christ's usage of the Old Testament there. Very interesting. Matthew chapter 24 verse 31, Jesus quotes from Isaiah chapter 27 verse 9, which is part of the Apocalypse of Isaiah 24 through 27. All agree Isaiah 24 through 27, or most agree, I should say, would be the end of time. This is the gathering, the great trump that would go out, the great trump to gather from the east and the west. This is the same as Isaiah chapter 11, Isaiah 43, 49, 50 and following, 40 through 55. And so we see Isaiah chapter 27 being quoted by Christ in Matthew chapter 24 verse 31, which is the gathering into the kingdom, gathering into the land, gathering into Zion, gathering into the new heavens and the new earth. This is the elect being gathered. It's not angels as messengers going out preaching the gospel, gathering people into the kingdom, as some would suggest. Even Gary DeMar, who I love, suggests that, which I think is wrong. This is the eschatological regathering at the day of the Lord, the completion, the consummation of the second Exodus. And this is very clear in Isaiah and the prophets, Jeremiah 30 through 34, Ezekiel 34, Ezekiel 36 and 37, the latter half of Ezekiel 39, Hosea 1 and 2, so on and so forth. And in Matthew chapter, now get this now, Matthew chapter 24 verse 34, truly I say unto you, all of these things will take place within this generation. Robert Gundry, in his work, The Old Testament in the Gospel of Matthew, says that Matthew 24:34 is drawn from Daniel 12 verse 7. Did you get that? Matthew 24 verse 34 is Daniel 12:7. Daniel 12:7, of course, is the end of the resurrection. Verse 2, it's the completion of the resurrection, the tribulation, when the power of the holy people would be completely shattered for 3.5 years. The revolt and siege and fall of Jerusalem from 66 to 70 AD. Very beautiful. Matthew 24 verse 30, of course, we have Zechariah chapter 12:10, and Matthew 24 verse 36. We have an interesting quote from Zechariah 14:7, that no one knows the day or the hour, speaking of the Feast of Tabernacles being fulfilled at that time. And we compare this to Revelation chapter 16 verse 14, which Revelation chapter 16, like Revelation chapter 14, Revelation chapter 19, and again in Revelation chapter 20 is the battle of Armageddon. And yet Revelation chapter 16, like most of Revelation, is focused on the harlot Jerusalem, the great city. And yet in Revelation 16:14 we have Zechariah 14 verse 2 being quoted, being alluded to. Is Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, the fall of Jerusalem, the fall of the city, using it different in Revelation 16? I don't believe so. Now, Mark chapter 13, verse 24. Mark's version of the Olivet Discourse. Very, very fascinating. I might go here. And these aren't all the texts, guys. I just went to Matthew, Mark, Luke, and a couple other texts and a couple in Revelation. But Mark chapter 13. He quotes from Joel chapter 3, which is an interesting passage, which is a great passage. Mark chapter 13, verse 14. But when you see the abomination of desolation standing where it should not be, let the reader understand, then those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Sorry, that's verse 14. Verse 24. Sorry. But in those days after the tribulation, the sun will be darkened and the moon will not give its light. That is Mark 13:24, which is an allusion to Joel chapter 3, verse 13. We go to Revelation chapter 14, verse 19 and 20. We have Joel chapter 3 as well, and Joel chapter 18, the harvest of wrath. Revelation chapter 14. So the angel swung his sickle to the earth and gathered the clusters from the vine of the earth and threw them into the great winepress of the wrath of God. And the winepress was trodden outside the city, and the blood came up from the winepress to the horses' bridles for a distance of 200 miles. This is also Isaiah chapter 63. So we have Joel chapter 3, we have Isaiah chapter 63 in Revelation chapter 14. And yet Revelation chapter 14 is a judgment of Babylon. Fallen is Babylon, the great city. And then we have the harvest of wrath of Babylon. And then we see here so many horses, which is mentioned elsewhere in Revelation, which would not fit. 200 million man army would not fit in Palestine, let alone all that blood, like the dispensationalists want us to believe. The winepress was trodden outside the city. Jesus was crucified outside the city, the great city, Luke 11:8, which is Jerusalem, Babylon, the harlot. And I'm not going to get into that now, as that is quite a bit to get into. But we do see in Revelation chapter 14, Joel chapter 3, and Isaiah chapter 63. Going to Revelation chapter 19, verse 13, we see again Isaiah chapter 63, verse 1 and 3. This is recapitulation. The recapitulation of the apocalypse. Revelation 14, Revelation 6, Revelation 12, Revelation 14, Revelation 16, 19, 20 are all repeats, including chapter 11. We have about 7 or 8 passages, chapters that are recapitulated over and over. Revelation is not read sequentially. 6 through 19 is not sequentially unless you're a premillennialist, historic or dispensational premillennialist. All scholars agree that aren't premillennialists that it's recapitulation. And so Revelation chapter 14, the battle of Armageddon, the second coming, the Parousia against Babylon, the harlot, Jerusalem. What's Revelation 19? It's the battle against Jerusalem, the battle of Armageddon. And yet Isaiah chapter 63, 1 and 3 is used. And so Revelation 14, Babylon, Revelation 19, Babylon, Isaiah 63 is the backdrop passage. And yet Revelation chapter 19 is the coming of Christ. in his kingdom, in the marriage, in the judgment of the great city. Matthew chapter 22, 1 through 14 is Jesus coming, in his kingdom, in the marriage, in the burning of the city that rejected him and the prophets. Just a little tidbit for you there. Let's go down a little bit here. We're almost done, guys. A couple more texts in Revelation, then we're done. Revelation 19:15. We have Psalm chapter 2, 9. Revelation 19:19. We have Psalm 2, verse 2 being alluded to. So we have the already of Psalm chapter 2, back in Acts chapter 2, and many other places, which with the enthronement of Christ on the Davidic throne, in the temple not made without hands, Hebrews 8, in the heavenly land, Hebrews 11, the heavenly Zion, Hebrews 12. We have that, but the not yet. It would be fully consummated at the second coming. And yet we see this in Revelation chapter 19, verse 15 and 19. That Psalm chapter 2, the kingdom there, which is no different than what Jesus taught on the kingdom in Luke chapter 13 through 20. And Matthew chapter 16, 24 and following, and 21 through 25. There's no difference here. Judgment on Jerusalem, judgment on the harlot that apostatized against Yahweh, who they were in faithful or covenant relation with. Revelation chapter 1:7. I have to do a study on this in sometime soon. Revelation chapter 1:7. We have Isaiah chapter 40 verse 5. Isaiah 40 verse 5 is found in Matthew chapter 3 verse 3, and speaking of John the Baptizer, John the Baptist. Isaiah chapter 40 is the second Exodus. It's clearly the second Exodus. Move the obstacles out of the way, out of the highway. It is identical to Isaiah chapter 35, Isaiah 35 and 40, identical language. Move these obstacles for the exiles to come up into the land. Isaiah chapter 40 through 55 is the second Exodus. Jeremiah 16, 23, 30 through 34, so on and so forth, the second Exodus. But Deuteronomy chapter 40 is the second Exodus. Revelation chapter 1 verse 7 is the second coming of the Lord, the thematic statement of Revelation. Just like in the book of Romans, we have Romans 1:16 as the thematic statement. Revelation has a thematic statement like most books. It's Revelation 1:7. And yet Isaiah 40, the second Exodus, is used. So Revelation 1:7, whatever would happen here, would complete the second Exodus. And yet we've previously seen in the teachings of Christ in Matthew 21 or 22, Luke 20, Mark 13, the second Exodus would be complete in AD 70. Also Daniel 7:13 is alluded to in Revelation 1:7. And a lot like to say, well, Daniel 7 in Matthew 24:30, Daniel 7 is Jesus going up to the Ancient of Days. He's not coming down to earth. Well, you have a problem here. You have a problem here, in my opinion. This is Jesus coming down. This is the second coming. This is the thematic statement of Revelation. And there's another passage which has in Revelation, which has Revelation or Daniel chapter 7. I'm trying to remember where it's at. Daniel chapter 7 as the fulfillment of the coming of Christ against Babylon. You can't get much clearer than that. And then in Revelation 1:7 we have Zechariah 12:10 through 14. And this we find in Matthew chapter 24 2 times. So Zechariah is alluded to in Luke and Mark. And yet some will agree and admit Matthew 24, Luke 21, and Mark 13 is AD 70. And yet Zechariah is applied to the coming of AD 70. And yet when they get to Revelation they say, oh no, it cannot be. But I'm going to post these verses here and the parallels for your benefit, guys. I just went to the Gospels, or the Synoptic Gospels, and the book of Revelation, just for the sake of brevity. I probably went over more than I wanted to, but hopefully I didn't hit 25 minutes to an hour. I don't think I did. But we're going to be doing a video in the next couple days, a pre-debate refutation of Stephen Whitsett's, quote, a peer, unquote, of Hebrews 9:28. The appearing of the second time of Jesus, of Hebrews 9:28. We're going to refute Stephen Whitsett on that, and that's going to be one of his main debate points in our debate. We're just going to smash it out of the water anyway, and that's what we've been doing lately, just smashing out of the water. Totally devastating. Starting a few weeks ago, I said, what the heck, I'll put my material up here that I knew I'd be using in the debate, and I started doing that with Matthew chapter 24 and the coming there. If Matthew 24 is fulfilled, then all prophecy is fulfilled. And I focus in on verse 31 of Matthew 24 and the implications there, and the prophetic backdrop there, and the implications for the Olivet of Matthew 24 and 25 on the New Testament corpus as a whole. But we're going to do that video, a pre-debate refutation of Stephen Whitsett's, a peer of Hebrews 9:28. Look out for it. It'll be up in a couple days, and this will be one of my more exciting videos, I do believe. Thank you for watching, guys. Godspeed, and keep studying. Keep studying to show yourself approved. Keep studying to show yourself approved. And if you don't have the hunger for truth, like I do, I have an insatiable hunger for truth, pray for that hunger for truth. Pray for that hunger for truth, as the truth will set you free. And then I find the more truth you learn, and the more you're into the Word, the more you're being conformed to the image of God, because we're having that renewing of the mind that Paul speaks about in Romans 12:2. Crucifying that old man daily. Praise God, praise God.